Hi, I have a question in particular about your interpretation of Marxism, since in the link that you have sent us, Marxist humanism was emphasized. And is it as opposed to people like Althusser, who is trying to give an anti-humanist explanation of Marx? And if so, why do you think nowadays we need the humanist version of Marxism more than the anti-humanist version? This is my first question. And the second is about the notion of historical progress. Do you think that Marx was right in emphasizing that there is a historical progress, even though he was sure that capitalism will increase the amount and intensity of the crisis? Do we still have should we be optimistic about there will be historical progress, or should we revise that optimism now, after especially the COVID crisis and economic crisis combined? Thank you.
The first one on why humanism, I mean, this is my whole intellectual life is caught up with this question. You know, some of the first things I wrote were on this. I think I have an article in 1986 called Sources of Marxist Humanism. So what's involved there? I mean, there's a lot of things that could be said, but let me just say that if you agree, which I think a lot of people that are in the Marxist tendency or even sympathy would agree, that the post-structuralist and post-modernist turn really undermine Marxism. And if you agree that that's not a good thing, then this is kind of like a syllogism almost I'm giving you. Then you have to say, where did that come from? Well, Louis Althusser started this thing of Marx is a humanist when he's young, but he's not really a Marxist yet. Now, as I say, there's a book called For Humanism. It hasn't been translated to Turkish. I have a big chapter, a long chapter in there. And what I point out there is, initially Althusser was saying, after 1846 with the German ideology, Marx becomes Marxist. But then he started debating capital with the humanists and other people a little, and he said, well, you know, there's that fetishism section in chapter 1 of Capital. That's kind of humanist and German idealists too much. So really, it's only after Capital that Marx drops the humanism. Well, if you concede that, then you're conceding that Marx is a humanist and almost implying we need to go beyond Marx. And so that is the gateway for Foucault. Foucault drops Marxism, but keeps the anti-humanism. And the problem with it, I mean, there's a lot of problems with anti-humanism, but the biggest political problem is that it makes it virtually impossible to be, the younger generation has this term I'm forgetting, but to envision a new society or a different social system. The resistance that exists in someone like Foucault is a short couple pages on resistance in a history of sexuality. It's cyclical. It's like, well, there's resistance and there's domination, and they go back and forth. But there's no real possibility of different social relations. And of course, that dovetails, that synchronizes very easily with the concept in neoliberal ideology that there's no alternative to. And there was a second question there. Well, I forgot the second one, sorry.
It was about historical progress. Some people claim that history is made up of tragedies, not of any progress, except for technological progress.
Yeah, well, I mean, the most dramatic example of that is Theodor Adorno. Yeah, there's been progress from the slingshot to the megaton bomb. You know, there's a lot of Hollywood movies like that have this same theme at a less sophisticated level. I think it's really a slant, a distortion of Marx and even of Hegel to say progress in the sense that the critics do. You know, progress is dialectical, and that's an abused term, but I think here it's worth mentioning because And in my newest book on the dialectic that just came out, it collects a lot of my writings, including this one I wrote in 1980 that was never published on George Lukács, The Young Hegel. The whole burden of George Lukács's book, The Young Hegel, is to point out that Hegel broke with Romanticism and was very critical of some of the trends in his own time, which he saw as reactionary. People like Jacobin or even Schelling, and that this was a retrogression, that the French Revolution had occurred, and then there were elements of Romanticism that were reactionary, and he sees it as a precursor of fascism. The book is a little he overstates the thesis, but there's an element of truth to it. And if you really study Hegel's dialectic and writings carefully, not just progress, but also retrogression is an important part of it. Now, frankly, I think Hegel does it a little better than Marx himself, because Hegel actually has a category of retrogression, because Hegel went through the French Revolution, but also through the reaction afterwards. And this is something that my mentor, Dunayevskaya, emphasized quite a bit too. And when what we call today neoliberalism was just starting, because she died in 1987, she had all these articles about the Ronald Reagan retrogression, that history was going backwards. So there is a concept of retrogression in Marx. Now, in Marx himself, there was no event similar to the Restoration after the French Revolution or fascism that occurred in Marx's own lifetime. So the theme is there, but it doesn't come out quite as strongly as it does in some 20th century Marxism or in Hegel. But in Marx, I think we have to point to the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, published on December 13th, 1851. And it's reading the first few pages of that book is like, dousing yourself in ice water. It's a perfect text to read if you're in the mood that someone is probably in when you're living under Trump or you're living under Erdogan, that depressed mood that we're in most of the time, and rightly so. So, okay, but there's one thing that's different about the concept of retrogression in Marx than in Adorno, because with Marx and Hegel, the dialectic, there is progress, but the progress has huge setbacks. But then it reconstitutes itself after a period of retrogression, like say fascism in Europe. The movements, if you survive, which you may not, I mean, they could wipe us out tomorrow morning with nuclear bombs, or they could just so destroy the environment that will become unlivable on the planet for humans. But assuming something less than that, the movement reconstitutes itself. And so at the end of World War II, you don't go back to where you were in 1936. You don't have like, women get the vote, even in France after World War II. There are large movements for peace. The word humanism actually becomes an important word in Marxism only after World War II. The anti-humanism of the Nazis was explicit. It actually makes the word humanism and the concept more popular, because there's a realization that when you get into these fascist or Stalinist regimes, that really every human being is in a sense targeted to some degree. Nobody can be safe. So that brings, so that's the protection of the human person and the dignity of the human person, not simply class humanism, but a broader humanism comes to the fore. So yeah, there's progress, but the progress has a lot of retrogression and setbacks, and there's no guarantee of how history is going to go. That's how I read both Marx and Hegel. And I think today we have to emphasize the retrogressive aspect a little more than maybe they did themselves. But the conceptual tools for doing so are already there in Marx and Hegel, in my view.
Thank you so much. My one last additional question is that after that stage of retrogression, can we be sure that another kind of progress will come? What I had in mind was not Adorno, but Walter Benjamin, history as a set of catastrophes and revolution as the emergency brake that stops that series of catastrophes. Would you agree with that formulation of history?
Yeah, well, I mean, Benjamin wrote, you're referring to the Theses and the Philosophy of History of, what is that, 1939 or 40. You know, my own father took that same pathway over the Pyrenees into Spain because he was fleeing the Nazis as well. Right a few years after, I mean, he was luckier because he was doing it in 1944, and by that time the French started to be more helpful because they knew that the Nazis were going to lose. So that's really the darkest hour of the 20th century. Yeah, and it's very important, as Hegel says, to stare negativity in the face. Like if you're in the United States, don't say, oh, great, Biden is now president. That January 6th small insurrection, that was just like a joke. We don't have to worry about it. It's all these old white people. They're gradually dying off. You know, we're getting the Latinos more, the Asian. You know, you have to really face that. And the only way you can move forward is if you really face reality, if you will. But if you look dialectically in the long run, you may not survive that long run. They're always, all these forms of oppression generate forms of resistance and new forms of resistance. Like, who would have thought that at your own university, I mean, when I went there in 2008, I didn't hear that much discussion of LGBT issues. And yet, because the reactionaries raised this question, it forced the students to defend it and forced a more open discussion of this issue in Turkey. And right now it has very demagogic implications, but in the long run, it's going to open up that discussion. That's my opinion.
Thank you so much for sharing that optimism with us. We really need that. Thanks.
And I think we have to organize. I mean, any left wing would say, well, we've got to form organizations, but we have to organize our thinking. We have to rethink all these issues. And you don't look as, are you a student?
No, I'm a lecturer in philosophy department, and my book came out of the same publisher as your book, Yordam Kitap.
Okay, because what is your? I was going to ask you. I bet you've written stuff. So what is your book?
I'm working on freedom, and my supervisor was Sean Sayers. Probably you know that, a Hegelian Marxist, and my main field is socialist feminism and freedom.
Yeah, well, I know Sean Sayers well, but he was very critical of my book on Lenin. You can find that book. He thought I lapsed into idealism too much. Because the tradition I come out of in Marxism sees the 1844 as like just as valid as Capital. And there's that little sentence in there that what we really need is a naturalism or humanism. This is not a direct quote, that transcends Aufhebung, both idealism and materialism, and is the truth uniting both. So I said that in China, I go to China sometimes and I talk, and they're very, very polite. It's a very polite society. So, and they have all these Western professors coming over, so I said, I criticized Mao, I was waiting for no reaction. And then I said, to me, the Marxist dialectic is a unity of idealism and materialism. It's both. And then this guy, because they can't talk politics there. It's much more repressive than Turkey. So, but this guy, this guy is, wait a minute now. This he has to, because usually they don't criticize forcefully, but this was too much. So, yeah, so Sean Sayers, he has that Marx and Philosophy Review of Books. He's very good, but that's an issue where if you want to get just not in the sense of polemicizing against him, but just to help to define my own position a little better.
And can you say more about how Marxist dialectics is a unity of idealism and materialism? I couldn't get it well enough. Can you just say a few sentences on that?
Sure. I mean, you have that, what you have in the best of Marxism, including Marx's own work, is a constant critique of crude materialism. So in one of those theses on Feuerbach, it said that the active element, that materialism has been contemplative, and the active element was developed by idealism. You have that. Lenin's own work, this is what my first book is on, how's it, cognition or consciousness, depending on the translation from the Russian, not reflects the world. I mean, if you're a Marxist, obviously you think that. If you're a materialist, not only reflects the world, but also creates it. Because and then Jean-Paul Sartre, who wasn't exactly a Marxist, but certainly he was indebted to Marxism. He writes about the strikes in 1834, and I think it was in France, the first strikes, some of the first mass strikes anywhere in the world. The workers actually not only go on strike, but they chase away the factory owners, they take over the town. And then he says they just sit there because they don't yet have a conception of how to organize a different society. They sit there, then the police come, attack them, arrest some of them, and a few weeks later they're back at work. And it's a conceptual lack. The concept of socialism had not yet penetrated a vision of a new society. And of course, we lack that today. I mean, I'm watching this film about the French resistance called A Village Français, a French village. And there's the communist guy. And so he's telling his woman friend, she says, what are you, because she's more social, what are you fighting for? She says, I'm fighting for like what Russia is. She says, well, what do you like about Russia? She says, well, in Russia, everyone is equal and there's no bosses. The workers elect their bosses. And it's like a totally free society. And that's what I'm fighting to bring to France. So he actually believed that. And then he ends up dying. He stays back to save some other people so they could escape. And he gets killed. And he actually believed that. And of course, it was a false belief. But without those, but there were plenty of other people who then argue with that and said, well, I'm not a Stalinist, I'm a Marxist-Humanist, whatever. But today, even the far left lacks a vision, or enough of a vision of the future. We get that a little bit with things like Gezi Park. I mean, that was a really great development to have that, to actually live the experience a little bit on a small scale of a new society. That's tremendously important. I still carry some of those type of memories with me for the rest of my life, from 1968, to experience, to taste real freedom a little bit. So and why did Marx write these books if he wasn't interested in ideas? Why didn't he just try to organize social movements? And then some say, well, Marx wrote the book, we don't need it, but we need to renew and develop it, obviously.